Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Race and Nation, Genocide, Terror in the 20th Century, an online professional development seminar sponsored by the National Humanities Center and the National Council for History Education. My name is Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs here at the Humanities Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. Before we get underway, I'd like to introduce you to the sponsors of the program. The National Council for History Education is a membership organization that advocates on behalf of educational issues, that holds annual conferences, offers webinars like this, and a variety of publications to help teachers teach history in K-12 education. If you want to learn more about what the National Council does, please go to their website, www.nche.net, and there you will learn all about the resources that the National Council can provide you. The National Humanities Center is located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. It's the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities. That's a real mouthful, so let me break it down. First of all, we're independent. That means we're a private nonprofit organization. We're an institute for advanced study, which means that the main program we offer is a fellowship program that brings scholars from this country and abroad to the center for an academic year to research and write on topics like history, literature and language, philosophy, criticism of the arts, that sort of thing. We opened in 1978. We've had about 1,300 scholars work here since then, and they've produced about 1,300 books. Now, the place may sound like an ivory tower, and from this picture, it looks like an ivory tower, but it's really not. The founders wanted it to connect with a wide variety of audiences, and one audience they were particularly interested in was connecting with teachers. And you can find out all about the things we offer teachers by going to America in Class from the National Humanities Center. America in Class is the name we've used to brand all of the material and services we provide teachers. Just go in your browser, type in America in Class. That will take you to this page, and there you will have access to all of the things we offer teachers. Now, let me remind you that after the seminar this evening, you can go to the website, the Nation, Race, and Genocide website, from which you obtained your readings for this seminar, and there you will find a recording of tonight's program along with a PowerPoint, and we invite you to plunder the PowerPoint. Use it for your classes. It's there for your use. On this website, you will also find access to an evaluation. Please go to the evaluation, fill it out, and submit it to us. You can do that all online. It will take just a few minutes. It means a great deal to us, and it means a great deal to the NCHE. We pay attention to what you say in the evaluations, and we use what you say there to improve our offerings to teachers. Now, once we receive your evaluation, we will send you a letter that you will be able to present to your local certifying authority to obtain whatever recertification credit your participation in this seminar warrants. So please get that evaluation into us. As I say, it's very important for us and for you too. Now, let me tell you how the seminar is going to work. Our scholar tonight, Jonathan Reynolds, will be lecturing, and from time to time he will stop and offer discussion questions. And if you have comments, we want you to present your comments and questions to him. And you can do that by using chat. You see on the right-hand side of your screen a column with names and all sorts of icons. At the lower part of that column, there's a box, and you can put your cursor in that box, type your message, and then click send. Hit the send button to the right, and your message will appear in the larger chat box above that. I will be following the chat all evening, and I will be bringing questions and comments into the conversation at appropriate times. If I don't get to your question or comment the moment it appears on the screen, don't worry about it. I will get to it when I can gingerly and politely interrupt Jonathan to bring in your questions and comments. But we hope you'll have lots of them tonight. Your questions and comments really make the seminars interesting. So please, we hope you'll actively participate. Are there any questions then before we begin? If everybody's ready to go, you see that little yellow smiley face icon on your panel there. If you could click on that and let me know that you're ready to start, then we can get underway. I see some coming in now. All right, good deal. I guess we're ready to go to learn about nation, race, and genocide and terror. So the forum, the pre-seminar forum, offered a really good amount of comments and questions. We had a very robust discussion of the topic on the forum. And here are the questions that you posed. Here is what you want to get out of the seminar this evening. What is the definition of genocide? Is the current definition too broad, too narrow? Was genocide practiced in the ancient world? Has the practice of genocide increased in the last century? What causes genocides? What role do scapegoating and competition for resources play in genocides? Are slavery and colonialism forms of genocide? How can we stop genocide as it is happening? How can we prevent genocide? How do we counter denial claims by the perpetrators and their supporters? In what way is race a social construct? How can we deal with student skepticism in the face of solid evidence? How can we promote empathy in our students? And how can we link the Holocaust to more recent genocides? All very good questions, and I think we're going to be able to get to all of them this evening in our seminar. And to help us weave our way through those questions, we are very pleased to have with us this evening Jonathan Reynolds, a professor of history at Northern Kentucky University. Jonathan teaches African, World, and Middle Eastern history. He is on the executive board of the World History Association. He has written widely on African, World, and Middle Eastern history. And he's published in various journals. He is the author of The Time of Politics, Islam and the Politics of Legitimacy in Northern Nigeria in 1950 through 1966. It came out in 2001, and he is the co-author of Africa in World History from Prehistory to the Present and Trading Tastes, Culture, and Commodity up to 1750. Now, let me just turn the program over to Jonathan at this point. Let me just locate him on my list of participants here to give him the baton, and we will get right underway. Okay, Jonathan, the board is all yours. Tell us about nation, race, and genocide.
I will do the best job I possibly can here in the time available. Welcome, everybody out there. I know you can't talk back to me directly, and I'm a classroom teacher myself, and so this is kind of a weird venue for me. But so don't be shy about posing questions through the chat, and I know that Richard is a trained professional here. He will pass those on to me. All right, well, let's get rid of my face here and move on to the core goals of this webinar. And as I just said, we've got an awful lot to cover. This is a huge topic. We're covering a lot of time and space and some very complicated issues. But we've broken them down here to just a few core points. First is just to gain an understanding of the concept of genocide. What is genocide and how did we come up with such a concept in the first place? And what is the place of genocide in history? What role does it play in world history, and more specifically in the history of the 20th century? Next, one of the core points, as you might guess from the title of the webinar tonight, is to highlight the power of ideas of race and nation in influencing the modern practice of genocide, particularly in the 20th century. These are just two of the most important things. There are other issues that influence genocide, but these are the ones we'll be stressing tonight. We might make some reference to some other ones along the way. Third is to understand the moral complexity of many 20th century genocides. Today is Holocaust Remembrance Day. We're coming up on the anniversary of the beginning of the Armenian genocide from 1915. That's marked on April 24th. But many genocides in the 20th century are not simple. And while we use the Holocaust as one of our main touchstones for genocide and the nature of genocide, many genocides are more complex and involve violence on all sides. And that's one of the things I want to get at here. And finally, the goal here is, as I said, we're covering a lot of time and space. So what we want to do is provide you with some insights, broad insights, and specific examples as tools to help you do a better job of teaching genocide to your students. This is a really important topic. I don't think students can really understand the nature of the world today without understanding the impact genocide has had on people's notions of justice and identity. So I really appreciate everybody, all 39 of you out there, for signing up and taking part tonight. But the caveat is don't try and remember everything. I won't be able to remember everything tomorrow myself. All right, so What's the overall structure of the discussion for the evening? Well, we're going to start out with some background. I'm a historian, and so I believe everything, the explanation for everything lies in the past. We'll start out with covering the concept of genocide itself. It's a 20th century concept. In fact, it is sort of conceived right smack in the middle of the 20th century. So we'll go over how that comes to be. And then we'll do a very brief background of genocide in world history. There's plenty of genocide in the 20th century. Unfortunately, that's what we'll be focusing on. But genocide is not new to the 20th century. So we'll do a quick survey of some examples of genocide in the past. Then we'll move on to what I really think of as the meat of the discussion here, and that is the argument, and that is the power of ideas, in particular in this case, the ideas of race and the idea of nation in the making of 20th century genocides. And that takes us back to the point I just skipped over, and that is, why do we see the 20th century as the century of genocide? And it's often used, if you look up, go to Amazon and type in century of genocide, you'll get a dozen books with that title looking at the 20th century. So we'll look at race and nation and their impact on genocide in the 20th century in particular. From there, we'll move on to sort of deconstructing the idea of race and looking at where it really comes from. And we'll give a similar treatment to the idea of nation. And both of these, and one of my things that always interests me as a historian is we have a whole set of words we use all the time, but we never really think about where they come from or what they mean. And race and nation are two of those, right up there with civilization and culture. Once we've sort of gotten that baseline of the sort of intellectual foundation of race and nation and the impact on genocide, we'll look at some case studies across the 20th century. And there are four I've chosen here for various reasons. It was not an easy set of choices to select sort of representative instances of genocide in the 20th century, but these are the four I came up with. The first will be the genocide of the Herero and Nama peoples in German Southwest Africa, that is modern-day Namibia, during the period from 1904 to 1907. This is sometimes identified as the first genocide of the 20th century. That is unfortunately debatable, but it's still a substantial incident and very influential in the modern history of Southern Africa and Europe. Next, we'll go on to look at the Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire and in the very young Turkish state from the period of 1915 to 1923. And then we'll move forward a fair bit in time to the Cambodian genocide, sometimes referred to as the Cambodian auto-genocide of the killing fields from 1975 to 1979. And then we will, for the final case study, one that's often very familiar to people of our age, that is the conflict and genocide in Burundi and Rwanda from 1958 to 1993. And you'll notice that there's a large period of time there. That's because there were a number of instances of intercommunal violence in Burundi and Rwanda prior to the major genocide in 1993. So I'll go over those because understanding that is crucial to understanding the genocide in Rwanda itself. And then for conclusion, I will present a number of themes of genocide in the 20th century, which I hope will be very useful to you in the classroom. All right, so here we go. The concept of genocide. You know, it's a sad statement about the nature of the 20th century itself, that this is the century where we get a concept of the structure. We get the invention of the word genocide to describe what is going on. And we know very well where this term comes from. It was constructed by Raphael Lemkin in 1944. Now, Raphael Lemkin was a Polish Jewish lawyer, and you could put those words in any order because that's a great insight into our sort of structure of identity right there. But so he lived in Poland. He was a lawyer. He was also Jewish, and during the 1930s, in his study of law, he focused on what he called, quote, crimes of barbarity end quote. And the examples that he used mainly were the Armenian and Assyrian genocides, both of which took place in the Ottoman Empire in the decades before the 1930s. When World War II broke out, he escaped to the United States by way of Norway in 1941, and in 1944, while working for the U.S. War Department, wrote a book entitled Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. And this is the first time in print that we have the use of the term genocide. And here's what he said. He said, by genocide, we mean the destruction of an ethnic group. Genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killings. It is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of the essential foundations of the life of national groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. The objective of such plan would be the disintegration of the political and social institutions of culture, language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of national groups, and the destruction of the personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and even the lives of the individuals belonging to such groups. I think it's notable just how many times he uses the word nation in that passage. Lemkin's work was clearly apropos to what was happening in the Holocaust at this time, and his work was very influential during the Nuremberg trials as well. And one of the outcomes of the Nuremberg trials was the concept of genocide being used as being a form of, quote, crime against humanity. So one of the key things that comes out of this is the 1946 UN resolution identifying genocide as a crime under international law. And it's also much of the time here that we're beginning to see the concept of international law developing as well. So the issue of genocide is part and parcel of the development of that concept. But the 1946 resolution says that genocide is a denial of the right of existence of entire human groups, as homicide is the denial of the right to live of individual human beings. And follows very closely on the end of this is the 1948 UN Genocide Convention, which becomes the fundamental sort of, somebody's saying low, okay, I'll turn myself up a little here. The UN Genocide Convention becomes a key part of international law regarding genocide. And it says, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. As such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to the members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, and which is not very cheerful stuff. So this is the concept that was established in the mid-20th century, but this was not, while this was used to describe what had happened in the Holocaust and previously in the 20th century, it was not something which was entirely new in world history. And so while we have this concept developing at this time, I've cited a few examples here from world history that could be used as examples of genocide prior to the 20th century. Now, I'm not going to talk about all of these because that would take up the webinar all by itself. But a few of these that people will likely be very familiar with, for example, are the Roman destruction of Carthage at the end of the Third Punic War in 146 BC, when the Romans finally were able to successfully break the defenses of Carthage. At this time, they not only killed a very large portion of the Carthaginians, but they enslaved those who survived. And that would certainly come under the heading of genocide by most modern interpretations of the term. Not often identified as a genocide, but perhaps incorrectly so, are the wars of religion during the Reformation in the 17th century, in particular the 30 Years' War itself, which ravaged its way across much of Western Europe during the early 1600s. This resulted in the death of over 50% of the population of many regions of Germany in particular, which was the main battleground during that time. Other examples include the Japanese invasion of Korea in the 16th century. This also doesn't get much attention, but the Japanese specifically ordered that Koreans would be exterminated during this time. And in a graphic example of how this was done, the Japanese shogunate counted the success of their troops by having the noses of all those who had been killed pickled and shipped back to Japan, so a proper accounting of the success of the invasion could be made. And this was followed in the late 1620s and up to 1632, also with the extermination of all Christian populations in Japan. It's not very well known, but tens of thousands of Japanese had converted to Christianity over the course of the 16th century as a result of contact with the Portuguese and the Dutch. And this population was exterminated at this time. And the last example I would use here would be the transatlantic slave trade itself, which runs mainly from the 17th century through the 19th century. There are, of course, earlier examples from the 1500s, but it really runs during this period as a major part of the Atlantic economy. Within Afrocentric circles, the Atlantic slave trade and the period of colonialism that follows it is known as the Ma'afa, as the disaster, and is treated largely as a genocide. And certainly scholars of the Atlantic slave trade would state that at least 2 million people die in the course of the transatlantic slave trade, just in the Middle Passage itself. Probably about 4 to 5 million of the 12 million people who are brought to the Americas die in the course of the labor on plantations, particularly sugar plantations in the Caribbean and in Brazil. And that's a very, very significant number of people who were killed during that time period. So that's the sort of perspective on genocide in world history. So on to the next.
Okay, Jonathan, if I can interrupt you, we've got a lot of interesting comments and questions here in the chat. People are asking if different instances of death and destruction are genocides. We don't have to deal with them now. Why don't we, I'm making a list here, why don't we postpone them till the end of the seminar, and then we can, once people have digested some of this information, we can throw the questions out. But people are asking about genocides in Central America, particularly in Guatemala.
Oh, yeah.
People are wondering about what's happening in Syria now against the Sunnis, the Australian policy toward the Aboriginal people, and U.S. policy toward Native Americans.
Yeah.
So let's move ahead, and I'll be sure to bring those questions up at the end of the program. We're not going to let you off the hook. I'm going to pose those questions to you. So let's move ahead, and maybe we can throw them out to the participants and have them decide at that point whether these things qualify as genocide. We've already had one comment saying that the definition is too broad, but we can come back to that. Let's move ahead.
Yeah, well, I will say at this point that if there's anything more heated than the issue of genocide itself, it's how to define genocide. Raphael Lemkin, of course, lays a baseline, as does the UN Genocide Convention, but there have been many suggestions for ways to refine or better define the topic, and I look forward to discussing that and some other instances as well.
Okay, so, we'll be sure to reserve time at the end for that discussion to bring our participants in. Okay, let's move ahead then.
Let's do it. Okay, well, let's move on to the first real issue here. How did we get there? Okay. So here's and this will cover some of the questions here. So one of the core questions here is, why was the 20th century so unbelievably bad? Well, one reason why the 20th century was a bad time for genocide was that the 20th century was a pretty bad time to be a human being in many ways. It was a century that saw an unprecedented amount of warfare. Of course, the most obvious examples of that are World War I and World War II, but it was a period where civil war and civil conflict was particularly common, and also particularly violent as well, not only because of, again, the world wars, but also because of decolonization and the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, all on top of those things, which will be things we will discuss in our examination of the case studies. you will see here that I've got highlighted the case studies that we're going to examine, but I'll mention just a few others here. Somebody was already asking about colonialism itself being a form of genocide. Certainly most scholars of colonialism see what is known as the Red Rubber Scandal in the Congo Free State, which opens up the 20th century. It was already ongoing in the late 19th century. But see that as a case of genocide, where a very conservative estimate of the number of people killed in the Congo Free State underneath the Belgian administration was 1 million, and numbers reach up towards 5 or 6 million in some estimates as well. But a few other specific examples is the manufactured famine in the Soviet Ukraine from 1932 to 1933. This was a famine engineered by the Soviet government to punish peasants in the Ukraine who were being recalcitrant in the process of the collectivization of agriculture. And once again, the conservative estimates of the number of people killed just in this 2-year span is about 3 million, with some estimates extending up to 7.5 million. A much more controversial example, but this again gets at the questions about, what is and what is not a genocide. Some folks believe that the strategic bombing campaigns of World War II, and these were aerial bombings of urban centers, specifically to target civilians, not to target military or industrial targets. Actually, my dates here are wrong. I noticed that shortly before. The first aerial campaigns against civilians began in China with the Japanese in 1932. It's one of the first instances of World War II with intentional bombing of civilian populations in order to kill civilians and create terror. But there are other examples, of course. The Blitz against London during the Battle of Britain is of course an obvious case. And this gets at the complexity of these issues as well. Both British night bombing campaigns against German cities and American day bombing campaigns against German cities, specifically the use also of incendiary weapons to start fires to destroy entire cities, kills hundreds of thousands of civilians during the World War II period. And many people have suggested that this too should be considered a genocide, since it's the targeting of civilians with the goal of not only killing them, but also spreading terror. Another complex example of genocide in the 20th century is the Indonesian anti-communism campaigns from 1965 to 1966 under the Suharto regime. This was part of the Cold War. The Indonesians were close U.S. allies in Southeast Asia. And this is a time when the Vietnam War, of course, is heating up considerably as well. While this didn't receive a lot of attention in the United States in the 1960s, we now estimate that roughly 500,000 Indonesian communists were executed and murdered by the Suharto regime at this time. And this is often referred to not as genocide, but as politicized, because the people were targeted not because of their race or their ethnicity, or their religion, but because of their political beliefs. And that's a complexity we will get at when we look at the example of the Cambodian killing fields as well. And people can read through this really quickly or come back and take a look at it. You'll notice I also mentioned the dirty wars in Argentina and also the civil war in Guatemala during the 1970s and 1980s. There's a lot of recent scholarship that's come out on Guatemala in particular in the targeting of peasant communities in the mountain areas and identifying that as a case of genocide. Also, again, linked to the Cold War.
Jonathan, we've got about an hour to go, and we've got some really good questions that I want to save till the end. We've got questions about global communications, possibly diminishing the possibility of genocide today.
Absolutely.
We also have a very important question about intent, which I intend to pose at the end. So let's be sure we have time. Folks, if we go a little bit over, please stay with us. We've got a lot of material to cover. Jonathan, let's go on to the chicken and egg problem.
All right, there we go. Well, and this gets to the issue of looking at ideas of race and nation and what role they play in the practice of genocide, especially in the 20th century. these are really tricky to get at because race and nation one are often almost the same thing. You will notice if you look at historical sources, these terms are used interchangeably. You will see references to the race or the nation of people. Americans often have a hard time with this because we associate race with color of skin and curliness of hair and things like that. While in many other parts of the world, race is associated more with ethnicity. So it reference to the French race versus the German race, for example. These ideas really come into their own in what we would think of as the modern period. These are not ideas that really influenced people's thinking in what we might think of as the ancient or pre-modern world. They really come sort of charging out of the world that comes post-1500. This is a period defined by the scientific revolution, the Reformation, the closing of the gaps of Pangea, one of my favorite things to say, which is a reference to Columbian contact with the Americas and the fact that parts of the world that had previously been isolated from one another are now in contact. So effectively all the continents have been merged into one in terms of the ability of human beings to interact, which relates to the excellent question somebody has raised about communication in the contemporary era as well. But we've also got the Enlightenment and the Atlantic slave trade going on at the same time, two, in many ways, polar opposite events, yet they interact extensively, and I'll hope to try and work some of that in. But the big point here is that the world was changing radically in this period after 1500, and that people in Europe in particular, but also in the rest of the world, and not only scholars, but common folks alike, were desperately trying to make sense out of a world that had suddenly become far, far more complicated and far, far more diverse than had expected. And at the same time, they were grappling with incredible social change, as well as economic and political change at home. And this is not only true in Europe. This is the perfect context for what happens in Japan during the era of the invasion of Korea in the 16th century. And my best guess is that one reason why so many people turn to ideas of race and nation is that they are a great way of simplifying perspectives on the world when the world seems to be becoming far, far more complicated. So populations all over the world are suddenly struck with the idea that there are way more ethnic groups than they possibly thought existed, and that there are thousands more languages spoken in their religions they had never heard of. And that's kind of overwhelming, and people in a way sort of fall back on a way of understanding the world through a very simple lens, and that is race and also nation itself. And my other point here, and by the 18th and 19th centuries, these ideas come to dominate the way people see the world, where they had not before. But the real caveat for us, and especially for our students, is that we grow up so immersed in ideas of race and nation. We're trained from the time of our birth. I grew up in the South to think in terms of race, and we were trained to look at the world in terms of nation, that we never really question how these things came to be and the influence they have on the way we see the world. And we also assume that they're ancient. Students are always asking, about the nation in the 5th century BC, the Egyptian nation or something like that. All right, well, Richard's going to tell me to hurry up, so I better hurry up. So let's very quickly get at the idea of race and where it comes from. Again, I'll stress that this is a very modern concept. It's really something that's only been around for a few hundred years. When you try and get down to nuts and bolts, the real thing that defines race is the idea that social, cultural, and perhaps even intellectual differences are, in italics, immutable and inherited. And tied to the race of the individual, and tied to the race of groups. And this gets down to the very essence of racism, is that it's the idea that if you know somebody's race, then you know stuff about them. You know how they think. You might know what kind of emotions they tend to have, what they're good at, what they're not good at. And these sort of associations with race can be positive as well as negative. When you say, oh, those Asians, they're really good at math, that's a form of racism. It might seem like a positive one, but that's what it is. But where the heck does this idea come from? Well, in part, it grows out of the scientific revolution, as I mentioned before. And this was a period when this new class of people we call scientists were completely obsessed with the idea of categorizing and organizing everything in the world. This ranges from, categorizing what kind of rocks there are, or igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary, or categorizing fish into cartilaginous fishes and bony fishes. But it also results in people categorizing people by looking at physical differences and assigning them to different conceptions of race. But it's very important to put this in context of what was going on. This was mostly a European idea initially, although it spreads very successfully through the rest of the world. And Europeans were trying to come to grips with a lot of things. They were trying to justify the conquest of the Americas. They were increasingly looking for ways to justify the enslavement of Native American peoples and African peoples. And all of these things came to increasingly come up with a system of race which defined Europeans as superior and other peoples as degrees of inferior as well. And they used lots of techniques to do this. Initially, it was through religious lens. There were lots of biblical, or what we might think of as Abrahamic, attempts to explain race, because you've got a real problem if you're coming at the world from an Abrahamic lens, which, be it Christianity or Islam or Judaism, says that all human beings are descended from a single couple, Adam and Eve, and that makes it pretty hard to understand how different people in the world could wind up looking differently. Different explanations were offered for this. Some populations were believed to be descendants of Cain, who of course had been marked by God as a result of his killing of his brother. So the sin of Cain marked him and changed him. A very common one is the curse of Ham, where Noah's son Ham sees his father naked and drunk, and rather than hiding his father's shame, mocks his father and is cursed by God. But it's not only he who is cursed, it is also all his descendants are cursed to be servants to all others. And so this is a very popular religious explanation, justification of why other people can be enslaved. And it is the curse of Ham which is used to justify African enslavement in no small way. Other things that come up are the idea of degeneration, is the idea that some human beings have been warped by sin. That is, the more population sin, the less they look like the image of God. And the idea is that Europeans, as the least sinful people in the world, still looked like God had made them, but other people had been deformed by sin. And finally, very popular in the 19th century was the idea of polygenesis, where many scientists, as well as theologians, suggested that there couldn't possibly have been a single creation of human beings. There had to have been multiple creations of multiple races of humans in different parts of the world. And this was very popular in the United States in the 19th century and used to justify segregation, because if God had created different people in different parts of the world, they were supposed to stay apart. But you can't just blame religion for this stuff. The rise of our notions of science and evolution are also critical, and this is really important to understanding how our case studies of genocide are going to play out. So I'm going to cover this as quickly as I can. The very idea of evolution has a huge impact on the development of the concept of race, and you'll notice the couple of pictures I've got there. One is that evolution science transforms our understanding of the age of the world. Most Abrahamic perspectives on the age of the world in the 19th century suggested that the world was about 6,000 years old. By 1900, we've got the idea that the world is millions of years old. And the perspective on evolution well into the 20th century is that human races dated back to a split of populations of Homo erectus somewhere about 1.5 million years ago. That's what's known as the multi-regional hypothesis. And thus, if human races had roots 1.5 million years into the past, then the differences between the races must be very, very great. A corollary to this was the idea that some races just must be more evolved than others. And I direct your attention to the classic evolutionary sort of diagram there on the right side of the PowerPoint slide. showing the sort of evolution from, Australopithecus afarensis on up through Homo erectus to modern human beings. And who, of course, is the modern human being? That's a European dude striding along right there. This was crucial in the understanding of race in the 20th century, with the idea that race and intelligence and morality could all be associated with each other, and that science could be used to prove that some races were smarter than others. And that there's the other classic image there, ranging from the chimpanzee through someone identified simply as a Negro, to Apollo Belvedere, none other than Apollo Belvedere there, showing that Europeans, who of course are descended from ancient Greeks, are by far the most evolved of all people. These scientific ideas take on very strong political expressions. Herbert Spencer is, of course, famous for advocating the notion of social Darwinism, which is the idea that not only are species in competition, the sort of oversimplified notion of survival of the fittest amongst species, but that human groups, human societies, human races, or human nations are in competition in the very same way, and that this competition between human societies results in the ongoing betterment of human society. When one society is able to either culturally or physically destroy another society, it's obviously the superior society that wins out. So Spencer's idea that human beings get better through conflict. Another corollary of this is eugenics. A lot of interesting stuff going on in the United States right now, lawsuits regarding people who were sterilized over the course of the 20th century, particularly North Carolina getting a lot of attention for this. Sorry, North Carolina friends. But this comes out in the form of sort of utopian aspirations, the idea that human societies and human races can be made better. And part and parcel of this, finally, is the idea of the nation, or the notion of the nation, to make it more mellifluous there. Well, the notion of the nation develops right alongside the idea of race, but the core idea here is that the nation serves as the means by which a race, through its political, social, and economic unity, will achieve greatness. So the nation becomes the vehicle for a race. And the analog, the corollary of this is, obviously, that the more racially, culturally, and religiously homogeneous a nation, the more successful it can be. And this is a great example here of this thinking from the very founding of the United States itself. John Jay wrote, and this was recorded in the Federalist Papers, he says, "Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs." Now, obviously, John Jay is speaking about Anglo-Saxon Protestant populations in the North American colleagues, and he is most clearly leaving out Catholic populations, who are, of course, already present in the American colonies. He is, of course, leaving out African American and recent African unwilling immigrants, as well as Native Americans, all this time, during all this. And of course, scholars and people familiar with American history know that American constitutional history is really the history of the expansion of sovereignty beyond this initial sort of small group. To fast forward here, by the 20th century, race and nation have become nearly inseparable. That the very idea of the nation is the idea of a race, and all races want a nation in the early 20th century, at least. And the best example I could come up with to sort of root people in this, and it's a great one to use for your students too, is the movie Birth of a Nation, which was, of course, released in 1916, so good and early in the 20th century. And for those of you familiar or not familiar with this movie, it is the story of the Civil War, but told from the perspective that the United States is not a nation until the end of the Civil War. And what happens is that Northern liberals, particularly abolitionists, learn during Reconstruction that Southern whites are not their enemies. They are their fellow countrymen, and that they have a common enemy in the form of Black people. with the famous ending of the movie when the Ku Klux Klan, and you see the movie poster there with the heroic Ku Klux Klansman astride his horse with a flaming cross. When the Ku Klux Klan comes in to save white women from black men who are black men in uniform, in U.S. Army uniform, who are preparing to rape them. And so that's a classic example of the sort of elision of race and nation. It was certainly D.W. Griffith's argument in that movie that's when the United States becomes a nation, when they realize that it is a nation of white people who must band together for success. And a very painful recent example of this, of course, is the Behring Breivik massacre in Norway. That's been in the news a lot in recent days, and I was reading some of the stories on that. And I was struck by that while Breivik is clearly crazy as a loon in many ways, that if you take his perspectives on nation and race, and if you were to put him back in 1900, he would not seem the least bit insane at all. Those were perspectives that were perfectly acceptable and considered scientific and rational and even admirable in the early 20th century. So that's the notion of the nation and where it comes from. And I want to really quickly show you how these ideas develop. And I'm a total map geek. Maps are some of my favorite things. And I think they're a great way to show students how perspectives on the world and human beings change over time. And let me really quickly show you a few maps so we can chart the development of these ideas of race and nation. In the bottom left-hand corner of the slide there, we have a 13th century map. This map was produced in what we now think of as Great Britain. Around this time, this is what we call a TO map, because the world is basically a big O, and it kind of has a T in the middle, which represents the Mediterranean and Black Seas, as well as the Red Sea kind of sailing off there. This is an east-oriented map, so China is right up there on the top. What we think of now as Europe is on the bottom left and Africa is on the bottom right. But the key here is that the world is all one big place. And that you'll notice that there are no national divisions on this map because almost nobody made maps that had different countries on them during this period of time. That's just not how people thought about the world, nor is there any mention of race. And actually, one of my favorite things about this map is that this was produced by a British monk, or an English monk. He probably had one or two tankards of ale too many in the course of it, and he actually labels what we would now identify Africa as Europe, and he identifies what we would now think of as Europe as Africa, in gold leaf, no less. But anyway, fast forwarding here to the late 17th century, you can see how radically people's perspective on the world has changed here. You take the shape of Africa from the Hereford Mappamundi there around 1300, and you fast forward about 500 years, and there's Africa all of a sudden in a shape that most of us, and our students would now look at and say, oh, that's Africa. There it is. That shape is Africa. But what's interesting about this is that Africa at this time is represented just like every other part of the world. Even in the late 1600s, when the slave trade is beginning to pick up at this time, but still there's no real objectification of Africans here. In fact, those are all Africans in the bottom left-hand corner. They're all dressed up and looking pretty snazzy, and that's a good example that even at this date, Europeans still largely identified Africans as possibly looking different from Europeans, but not being fundamentally different in any other real way. And the map is labeled just like other parts of the world. There are lots and lots of little kingdoms identified on it, and mountain ranges and everything like that. So the DeWitt's map of Africa looks like his maps of just about everywhere else.
Jonathan, let me jump in here and ask you to clarify okay. That point. You said the Europeans at this time thought Africans were pretty much like everyone else. By 1688, we had the slave trade booming. And in order to have slavery, you've got to have a sense of difference, and you've got to have a sense of inferiority. So how do you square this sense of Europeans seeing everybody as essentially the same with their dealing in slaves?
Okay. Be warned, I could talk for the rest of the seminar on this subject.
Well, you can't actually. We don't have that much time.
Right, exactly. It's important to keep in mind here that slavery is a human universal. It's very rare to find societies that don't enslave people in world history. And indeed, Europeans not only enslaved Native Americans, they not only enslaved Africans, But well into the 17th century, they enslaved other Europeans. It's a very little known fact of the transatlantic slave trade that during the late 16th and early 17th century, roughly 50,000 Europeans, mostly debtors from European prisons, but also people who just had the misfortune to be drunk in Liverpool while a slave ship was being loaded up, were forcibly transported to the Americas as slaves. These were not people who went as indentured servants. They went as slaves. So the fact that Africans are being enslaved in the 1600s does not mean that Europeans see them different from other Europeans. Now, there are certainly elements of class that are part of this. European nobles saw themselves as smarter than European peasants. And similarly, they saw African nobles as smarter than African peasants. And the idea that race defines everybody hasn't really completely taken hold. It's beginning to show up by the late 17th century, but it's not dominating how people see the world at this time. So I'll move forward from there. I hope I've answered the question.
Okay, let's move ahead.
All right, so I want you to see how radically things change in just the next 100 years. Here we have in the upper left-hand corner another map of Africa, and I use Africa because I'm an African historian first and foremost. I know a lot more about African stuff, but also because Africa comes to be the foil against Europe, as Africans come to be the foil against Europeans in notions of civilization and sophistication as a result of this development of this idea of race. And here we have 1771 by a British map maker by the name of Joshua Reynolds. And it's kind of hard to see here. Africa is labeled not only, you'll notice that the one representative African here is now scantily clad and looking much more tribal and primitive, and that's a big part of what's happening during this time. And Africa is identified as Upper Ethiopia to the south and Lower Ethiopia across the West African forest region there. But just a little bit up, and maybe Richard can work his magic with his highlighter here. Just above where it says Lower Ethiopia, you will note that it reads Negro land across the top there. And this happens in maps in various places, but here's where we're seeing regions of the world coming to be defined by race. And you'll also notice that the map of Africa is getting more empty at this time. That what had been a lot of detail in African maps in the 1600s, now it's becoming more and more empty. And in fact, by the time you get into the 19th century and early 20th century, you'll see huge swaths of Africa identified as unexplored. That is, that they've been dehistoricized until Europeans get to them. But it's the fact that it says Negro land that is the big point I'm making there. This is the development of the idea of race. And if you look forward here to the bottom right-hand corner, again, just about 100 years ahead again, to Boynton's map from 1856. This is a map of the world showing the races of man. And so once again, this is, and you can see how dominant this idea is. You can't find maps like this from the 1600s. There are no world maps of race in 1600s. But by the time you get to the 19th century, they are part and parcel of textbooks everywhere. That this is how we come to understand the world. And you'll notice if you look at North America there, part of it is still Native American, but with the European population sort of oozing across, and that's going to be part and parcel of the expansion of colonialism. Then very quickly, then from the early 20th century here in the top left-hand corner, this is the expansion of colonialism. So here we see the overlay of both issues of race and issues of nation. You have nations in many parts of the world, but the expansion of colonialism, particularly across Africa and Southeast Asia and India, and Australia for that matter. And this is important because colonialism is largely justified on grounds of race. Not only, but largely. And then finally, in the bottom right-hand corner, there's an almost modern map. We don't have the Southern Sudan on there. But, you know, this is the map we try really hard to get our students to remember, right? We try to get all our students to learn all the nations of the world. I know I beat my students to death with that. But it's important to realize that in teaching them to think of the world that way, you're also defining the world and giving meaning to this idea of nation. So finally, on to the case studies. The goal of these is to provide you with a chronological examination of the different ways ideas of race and nation play out in the genocides of the 20th century. those 4 case studies. And so I will move straight on here. The very first one is the case of the Herero and Nama genocide in what we now think of as Namibia in southwestern Africa. This region comes to be a German territory as a result of the Conference of Berlin in 1984 and 1985. And the context here is, of course, the European countries were on the verge of going to war with each other in the 1880s, largely over competition for colonial holdings in Southeast Asia and Africa. And one solution to this threat was to sit down like gentlemen and divide up the continent of Africa in a civilized manner. And as a result, the Germans managed to get their holds on southwestern Africa, in part because German missionaries had been active in this region for roughly 100 years. And this is very important because we tend to understand this idea of European colonialism as a competition between modern civilized Europeans and sort of primitive tribal Africans. And that's why I've included this picture here. What you have is a picture of a number of Herero dignitaries who are having a talk with a German officer during the 1890s. You will notice that they are dressed in what we would think of as a European style, but these are clothes that wealthy Herero had been wearing for decades at this point. And those are very, very typical Herero hats there too that they're wearing. So there have been a lot of interactions between Europeans and populations in southwestern Africa for well over 100 years. But things change radically as a result of the Conference of Berlin when the Germans start pushing a significant number of settlers into the region. And this leads to growing tensions with the local populations, especially the Herero and also another group called the Nama, who are largely pastoralists, and pastoralists need a lot of land. And this German immigration into the region results in a small conflict in 1896. That is resolved through sort of diplomatic means. But then things change radically at the beginning of the 20th century. In 1903, actually, the Germans begin moving to disarm the Herero and Nama, who are fairly heavily armed, by the way, as are most African populations in the late 19th and early 20th century. The Germans are trying to seize their firearms through just sort of administrative means, but more significantly, very large numbers of Germans are moving into the area, and the Germans are opening a rail line into the interior. And the Herero, and shortly after the Nama, see this as a huge threat and launched a premeditated attack against German populations, or actually European populations in the region, not just Germans. And this results in the killing of some 150 Europeans. And it's important to note that these are not only German soldiers or German men, these also include women and children at various farm outposts and such. And initially during this conflict, the Germans are at a huge disadvantage. There are only about 750 German troops in the region, and they are forced back into the 2 urban centers of Okahanja and Windhoek, and are successfully besieged by the Herero and Nama. But things have radically changed in the world thanks to steamships. The Germans are able to bring in a very substantial number of troops, roughly 14,000, and with them, armed with machine guns and artillery, are able to quickly defeat the Herero and Nama, who are driven back into the Kalahari Desert. And it's in the course of this that we get what we see as a genocide in this region. And it's important here to see that the German general von Trotha, who's most infamous in African history, states even before the conflict breaks out, he says, "I believe that the nation," I highlighted that myself, he's referring to the Herero, "as such should be annihilated, or if this is not possible by tactical measures, have to be expelled from the country. This will be possible if the water holes from Grootfontein and Gobais are occupied. The constant movement of our troops will enable us to find smaller groups of the nation who have moved backwards and destroy them gradually." And you'll see there at the bottom right, that's a German representation of the conflict. The story of the war against the Hereros and the Hottentots. That's a very German perspective on what the Herero and Hottentots look like there. And I ask you to sort of compare that to the picture you saw on the last page. Okay, I'll try to move a little faster here. The next quote, I won't read it, but it's where von Trotha says that he will order his troops to fire on all Hereros, women and children. And so this is what is known as the extermination order. The Herero and Nama are driven into the deserts. The water holes are poisoned. And within a short period of time, the will of the Herero to fight or even run has been broken. Tens of thousands emerge, who have not yet been killed, emerge from the Kalahari Desert and surrender to the Germans. Some of the sources I gave you give some examples of what happened here. Many of those who are deemed too weak to walk are killed on the spot. Tens of thousands of others, though, are taken to concentration camps along the coast and are then hired out to German companies and farmers as forced labor. Tens of thousands more die of starvation, disease, and exposure. And perhaps in one of the most strikingly sort of prescient events of this, also many are dissected as medical experiments, as are many children who are the result of rapes of Herero women by German soldiers. And the scientific work, so-called scientific work of these studies becomes the basis of a lot of German ideas of race and racial superiority. And I've got some very ugly pictures, especially in the bottom left-hand corner there, of some of these specimens that were transported back to Germany. And in the middle there, you'll see a picture that is of a Herero skull that was recently repatriated to Namibia as part of ongoing negotiations between the Germans and between the Namibians regarding reparations and the repatriation of human remains from German scientific collections. I can't help but mention here that this, of course, echoes a lot of issues between Armenian genocide. The Armenian genocide is getting some attention in the news right now because we're coming up on April 24th, which is the anniversary of the launching of the Armenian genocide, at least as identified by Armenian populations and activists. But the Armenian genocide has also gotten some attention recently, and kind of bizarrely, I must say, through the power of the Kardashians. Now, I don't know anything about the Kardashians because I don't watch TV, except for what I've learned just reading about it recently. But apparently, Kim and Chloe, or whoever the rest of them are, have actually been using their fame to popularize the case of the Armenian genocide. But the background here, and this one really helps highlight our understanding of race and nation. The Herero and Nama genocides are complicated, involve race and nation in that they're justified on the basis of racial inferiority as understood by the Germans and by the expansion of German national power. The case in the Armenian genocide is rather different in that this is an internal issue within the transformation of the Ottoman Empire in its transition from an Ottoman Empire to a Turkish nation. And so it's really important here to contextualize this, that the Ottoman Empire was, for much of the modern period, the dominant power of the Eastern Mediterranean, and in many ways the dominant power reaching well into Europe. It's not until 1683 that the expansion of the Ottoman Empire into Europe is reversed, and it begins a very slow and drawn-out process of shrinking from that time. But in the late 19th century, the Ottomans were very, very much aware that the Ottoman Empire was in trouble. You know, there's the famous characterization of the Ottomans as the sick man of Europe. Well, Ottoman political elites were very much aware that the Ottoman Empire was not having the best century, and a number of leaders, particularly this group known as the Young Turks, called for a rapid process of modernization, which would allow the Ottomans to better compete with this new expanded European military and economic threat. And some of the ways that they sought to modernize the Ottoman Empire, it seemed perfectly understandable. They sought to expand and modernize the bureaucracy and to transform the Sultanate into a constitutional monarchy. They sought to industrialize, to transform the economic base of the Ottoman Empire and develop textile industries and heavy iron industries and such as this. All that makes perfect sense, but the real crucial point here is that they also saw the multicultural nature of the Ottoman Empire as a key impediment to Ottoman success. And this is true, by the way, of course, of almost all empires. Empires are pretty much by definition multicultural and multi-ethnic. Now, they always have hierarchies of power, but they are still inclusive in many ways. Nations are not at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And the Young Turks in particular see that it is essential to create a Turkish nation. That is, that groups within the Ottoman Empire who are not Turkish, that is, Turkish in terms of language, Turkish in terms of dress, who are not Turkish in terms of religion, and that not only means being Muslim, but it also means being a particular kind of Muslim, that if groups weren't like that, they were undermining the unity and thus the potential for success of the Ottoman nation as they hoped to create. And what we see in the course of this is the outbreaks of state-sponsored violence against non-Turkish groups. In 1894 through 1896, there are outbreaks of violence against Armenians, there are outbreaks of violence against Assyrians, and there are outbreaks of violence against Arabs as well. Which are all these, sort of other ethnic groups within the Ottoman Empire. And this, of course, comes to a head during World War I, and that's not much of a surprise. And one of the big themes here, by the way, is that genocides most often take place during periods of warfare or wider conflict. Not always, but most often. And World War I was also largely a war of nationalism. Of course, there are other reasons why World War I takes place, most of them incredibly foolish, but nationalism was a huge contributing factor to World War I. And so it's not too surprising that the Ottoman sense of nationalism built around this Turkish identity was growing in strength. The fact that the Ottomans were fighting against Russia in World War I was particularly influential in that most Armenians were Russian Orthodox Christians, and thus were seen as a sort of potential fifth column inside the Ottoman Empire, likely to side with either actively or simply mire down the Ottoman war effort. So there was fear of Armenian collusion with the Russians. There was fear of Armenian nationalism, the idea that the Armenians would use the conflict to try and create an Armenian nation, just as the Greeks had already been successful in doing earlier in the 19th century. And it's important to keep in mind that during World War I, there were very real ethnic and national revolts against the Ottoman Empire, most significant being the Arab revolt, fostered by the British in no small part. I assume most people here have seen Lawrence of Arabia. Well, that's the story of the British encouraging the Arab revolt against the Ottomans in order to tie down Ottoman forces and make things easier for the Russians and for the British invasion of Anatolia elsewhere. So this leads, all of these factors lead to the Ottoman government deciding to eradicate the Armenians as part of this nation building process, and also in order to help ensure the success of the Ottoman armies in the war. These are important sort of components of how genocides take place, often in the 20th century. The first thing that the Ottomans do is remove those Armenians who are the greatest threat are perceived as the greatest threat to the Ottoman state. Those are Armenian troops. Those are some of the first people to be killed, but also Armenian leaders, wealthy merchants, and the educated class as well. What follows the death of this small sort of elite minority is the forced removal of populations from village centers or urban areas into remote locations, into rural locations where many are massacred. Most of the deaths in the Armenian genocide take place during an extended forced march. Some actually survive all the way to Syria, but along this march, people die of exposure and dehydration. The survivors' accounts we have, it's that people were denied food and water, as well as any kind of cover from the elements during this march. They were also attacked by local populations. It was made evident that local populations could attack the Armenian columns being marched out. They could attack them with impunity, and that because these populations were trying to transport as much wealth as they could, because they didn't know where they were going, that there was a lot to steal from these populations. So they were attacked and robbed and killed along the way. There was also the forced assimilation, and that's a Dodge word if ever there was one, of women and children. Many Armenian women were raped and forcibly driven into union with men from other groups as a means of assimilating them into Turkish society. And that's another trend we see in genocide in the 20th century. And of course, part of this is the lure of land and property for these other populations who are not targeted. It's, for example, during this time, there is the Kurdish population in the region supports this particular act of genocide, which is, of course, foreshadowing for the treatment of the Kurds in the region in the future as well. Documentation is not outstanding, but we estimate roughly 1.5 million people were killed in this period from roughly 1915 to 1923. But the real key point I want to make here is that this is part and parcel of the successful, I put that in quotes, but the successful creation of the Turkish nation. This is the time when we see the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the creation of Mustafa Kemal, that's Ataturk's modern Turkey. And Turkey is, of course, modern because it is a nation, not an empire, and that it is built around the ideal of a single ethnicity in the form of the Turks. And of course, one of the other themes of this is that there was relatively minor outcry against the genocide at that time. Of course, there was a lot going on in World War I, and people were more than a little numbed to mass death and destruction at this time, but there was little follow-up. And one of the main themes of the 20th century has been the ongoing Turkish denial that this was a genocide. They state that this was a movement of populations out of a conflict zone, and that, yes, people died along the way, but it was not an intentional genocide. That, of course, is a fine example of the contested nature of genocide in the 20th century. All right, so that's World War I.
Okay, John, if I could interrupt for a second. We have a question here about the Herero and Nama genocide, and I think it might be on the minds of more than one person. Okay. Give me your 15-second answer. Are there currently any Herero or Nama alive?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I'm sorry, and that was me trying to go a little too fast here. We estimate that the Herero and Nama population in 1904 was around 80,000 people. Southwestern Africa is fairly arid and not a very densely populated place, even by African standards. It's pretty clear that at the end of the genocide by the German colonial government, about 60,000 people have been killed, leaving about 20,000 Herero and maybe about 5,000 Nama at the end of that conflict. And so there are substantial Herero populations in Namibia to this day. They are the majority of the population. They outnumber the descendants of the German settlers. It's notable, though, that at the end of the conflict, the German settlers get their pick of the best land in the region, and it is very shortly after the genocide that it is discovered that Namibia is basically one big pile of diamonds. So the expansion of De Beers is a big part of the German colonization of Namibia. And so there are Herero and Nama in Namibia to this day. They are considerably less wealthy than the German populations who occupy it, though.
Mm-hmm. And then we have a comment here about the Young Turks. It seems to contain a certain amount of irony. Writer notes, the Young Turks seem to perform a cultural genocide on themselves, banning the use of the Arabic script, enforcing the use of Latin script, banning the use of the veil by women, and forcing the adoption of European dress and garments. How would you respond to that?
Oh, I would first say that, wow, what a great insight, and what a great question. And my response to that would be that that was the definition of modernization that the Young Turks were embracing at this time. And it's important to place the Young Turks in the broader context of what is often referred to as Islamic modernism in the late 19th and early 20th century. That there were many elites within the Middle East, and not only in Turkey, who argued that Islam was a modern religion, it was a flexible religion, it was a flexible culture, and that there was no problem in adapting things like different scripts, that those were just part and parcel of modernity. It is important to keep in mind, though, that Ataturk turns out, of course, to be a very extreme secularist, and he is, and that's one reason why he's celebrated in the West. If anybody here remembers for example, following the Iran-Iraq war, that many people said, well, maybe now Iraq will become more like Turkey, because Turkey is our sort of model of a good Islamic state. But there's great irony there, of course, is that, what makes Turkey, quote, modern, end quote, is its creation of this incredibly harsh nation that denies the rights of non-Turks. That's what nations do, at least in the early 20th century.
Okay, we have another question about the Armenian genocide. Have the Armenians assimilated to Turkey?
Oh, okay. Well, throughout the 20th century, non-Turkish groups in Turkey have very limited ability to express themselves culturally. This is true not only for surviving Armenian populations, but for surviving Assyrian populations, Jewish populations, other Christian minorities, and Arabs and Kurds. And up until the 1980s, it was illegal to sing Kurdish songs in Turkey. And so, it's a very complex thing what people do in those situations. People often try very hard to hold on to notions of culture and notions of identity in opposition to this forced assimilation, but many people, of course, assimilate. And I don't want to essentialize identities too much, but they're people who are, the Armenian populations of Turkey have become much more what we would think of as Turkish over the course of the 20th century, although their identity remains in many ways Armenian, if that makes any sense.
Okay, I think it does. I think we can see something like that working with ethnic groups in the United States. They're Americans, and yet they still retain, strong ties. So anyway, we've got about 15 minutes or so we're going to have to move along. I want to be sure to get to these questions that we reserve for the end.
Absolutely, and I don't mind going a little bit later if people are willing to stick around. Cause
I hope they will be.
It's one of the more depressing topics I've talked about in a while, but it's really important, and I'm happy to do it. Okay, well, let me move on here to the Cambodian case, because this is one that really complicates things. And I chose this specifically because it does not fit as neatly with my model of race and nation in the making of genocide. And because this is what is often called a politicide or an ideological genocide. Real quick background here is we have to look at the context of the Cold War in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia had been at war since the outbreak of World War II. That conflict does not end with the end of World War II. It simply shifts gears to being a war of liberation against colonialism, particularly in Vietnam, where the Vietnamese spend World War II fighting the French, because the French in Southeast Asia are on the side of the Japanese. And then at the end of World War II, they shift to fighting the French, who have declared that they are not going to decolonize Vietnam. But so there's been fighting here for decades. By the time we get into the 1970s, the immediate background here is that this Cenocides government, this is a monarchy, up until 1970 has tried very hard to remain neutral in the conflict in Southeast Asia, particularly relating to the conflict in Vietnam. And they had done this by trying to give both the Americans and the Soviet-backed communists in Vietnam a little of what they wanted, in hopes that they would then sort of leave Cambodia alone. This changes radically in 1970 when the monarchy is overthrown by a military coup. This is Lon Nol, who takes charge in 1970. He is what we would consider a sort of right-wing military dictator. He's a strong supporter of U.S. interests in the region. And in particular, what he does is he gives the United States the go-ahead to start launching airstrikes, B-52 airstrikes, against suspected Vietnamese bases and supply lines in eastern Cambodia. This is important because it results in the deaths of, we estimate now, about 150,000 Cambodians. And those are deaths not only from direct airstrikes, but also deaths from starvation because of the use of defoliants against crops in that region. What this results in is that many Eastern Cambodians begin to support the Vietnamese communists in a way they had not done before, and also to launch a revolt or rebellion against the Lon Nol regime. And this is where we get the Khmer Rouge, which simply means the Red Cambodians, the Red Khmer. The leader of the Khmer Rouge is Pol Pot. That means brother number one. He himself is an interesting example of the impact of colonialism. He had been raised in a prosperous family. He had attended school in radio and television repair in France, but later joins the Communist Party and is trained in North Vietnam and leads the effort to overthrow the Lon Nol government, and is successful in doing that in 1975, in no small part because following the American pullout from Vietnam in the early 1970s, the U.S. had also pulled support out from under Lon Nol, allowing the Khmer Rouge to take power in Cambodia. And one of the first things that happens there is that the name of the country is changed, Kampuchea, which just means Cambodia, just a different way of saying it. But what happens next is what's most remarkable about this, is that the Khmer Rouge do not simply mean to set up a Soviet-style or communist-style government. They are greatly inspired by Mao's Great Leap Forward and Mao's Cultural Revolution, and seek to create an agrarian peasant utopia in Cambodia. And as a result, there is a forced depopulation of all urban regions. In the time from 1975 to 1979, Cambodian cities are completely emptied of all populations. And all sort of trappings of what we would think of as it's a word I don't like to use, but quote modern, end quote, society are shut down. Factories are shut down, schools are shut down, universities, hospitals, bicycles, money, cabs are all banned. But more significantly, populations then that everybody's forcibly moved into the rural areas, and the idea is that they are going to create these incredible, this sort of peasant utopia where everyone is equal and everybody works the land together as a community in groups that are organized in work camps by gender and age. So families are all forcibly separated. Many people die just of starvation and overwork as a result of this, but there's also specific targeting of populations at this time. Anyone who is deemed to have been sort of tainted by modernization or westernization is killed. People are killed for expressing affection to one another. In particular, non-Cambodian minorities are targeted, so there is some element of race in this. If you were Chinese and living in the city, if you were Vietnamese and living in the city, your chances of surviving what are known as the killing fields were effectively zero. Same for Thai minorities, same for Cambodian Muslims, same for Cambodian Christians as well. And it's estimated that between 1.5 and 2 million people were killed during this period from 1975 to 1979. Many dying of disease, exhaustion, or starvation, or by execution. And that's about 20% of the total population here. And it's one of the ironies of the Cold War that the end of the Cambodian genocide occurs when the Vietnamese communist state invades and overthrows the Khmer Rouge. So in this case, it's the Vietnamese communists who are the good guys in Cambodia. And that's what brings the genocide itself to an end. Pol Pot, of course, survives in hiding and sometimes in exile well into the 1990s and gives many, many interviews to various reporters and press regarding what the Khmer Rouge thought they were doing at this time. So this one, again, is it sort of complicates our notion of race, but what the key point here is that the Khmer Rouge believed they were creating a utopian nation by transforming Khmer society radically in this, and that it justified, in this case, just about any action at all. There is a often quoted Khmer Rouge saying at this time, which is, alive you are of no value to us, dead you are of no expense to us. So it's a particularly extreme case from the 20th century there. All right, and the very last one here, which I need to cover in about 3 minutes, which is of course impossible, but I'll do the best I can, and that is the case of genocide in Burundi and Rwanda. The really quick version of the background here is that this is a classic, in fact, it's the classic case in many ways of the creation of identities in the 20th century. And that is that the conflict in Rwanda in particular was presented as this conflict between ancient tribes, which is how things are often described in African context. The idea that the Hutu and the Tutsi are different tribes, and so obviously they hate each other. The reality, though, is that prior to the 20th century, there was no real notion of being Hutu or Tutsi. There were notions of being pastoralists, which is what most Tutsis are, not all, but most. And there were notions of being agriculturalists, who are what most Hutus are, but not all. And that these groups had lived together for at least 500 or 600 years. They speak the same language. They speak Rwanda-Undi in both Rwanda and Burundi. And that they had interacted for a very long time and intermarried for a very long time. There have been all sorts of genetic attempts to show that the Tutsi and Hutu are different peoples. And while there are some genetic differences between them, they have far more in common than they have setting them apart, which is, of course, true for all human beings as well. The key point here is that this region is very fertile and densely populated, especially by African standards. But this region comes under German control, not to pick on the Germans too much, but the German control, again in the 1880s as a result of the Conference of Berlin. And first the Germans and then the Belgians, because Germany loses all its colonial holdings following World War I, understand their role as colonizers through the lens of race. But they not only see this in terms of their superiority over African populations, but they also see it in terms of a hierarchy of superiority. And in particular, both the Germans and the Belgians look at the Tutsi and they decide that the Tutsi are natural rulers, or, quote, a martial race, end quote, which is a very common European distinction at this time. And again, that goes back to these social Darwinist notions that people who kill other people are obviously superior races. And they see the Tutsi as being superior, and that this comes with notions that the Tutsi are taller, the Tutsi have thinner noses. That's really not an easy thing to support, but they come up with these notions anyway. And as a result, the Tutsi become the backbone of the colonial states in both Rwanda and Burundi. And over the course of the 20th century, the Tutsi are the only populations who are given access to Western-style education. As a result, they fill all of the available African positions in the civil service, and very importantly, they fill the police and the military. And the core point here is that in the late 1950s, when all of a sudden Europeans look around and realize that the world has changed radically and the colonial era is coming to an end, and the Belgians announced that they are going to pull out, the Belgians announced that they are going to establish parliamentary democracy on the way out the door. And this, of course, means that if there's going to be popular sovereignty in Rwanda and Burundi, the Hutu are going to suddenly become the dominant power, because I didn't mention this before, but the Hutu make up about 85% of the population in both countries. And the folks identified as the Tutsi make up only about 15% of the population. In both cases, this met with an attempt by Tutsi populations to seize control of the newly independent states militarily. This was successful this was successful in Burundi. The Tutsi were able to seize power and maintain this sort of minority control over the government, but not in Rwanda. In Rwanda, there's what's known as the Hutu Revolution in 1959, and the Hutu seize power in the country. To summarize very quickly, what happens as a result from 1958 into the 1990s is that there are a series of conflicts between Hutu and Tutsi populations in both countries, but especially in Burundi. The theme in Burundi is over and over again, Hutu populations attempt to rise up against this small Tutsi ruling minority, and the Tutsi control the state, they control the military. The Hutu will attack Tutsi populations, and then the Burundi military would sweep in and have attacks in retribution against the Hutu populations, and this results in tens of thousands of deaths over the course of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. And populations in Rwanda are very much aware of this. What happens then in 1993 is, in the attempt to move towards popular elections again in Burundi, those are once again overthrown by the Burundi military, and the Hutu elected president is assassinated. But then the president of Rwanda, who is Hutu, is assassinated in 1994. His plane is shot down. This also takes place in the context of an invasion of Rwanda by a army of Tutsis who have been living in exile in Uganda during this time. And this is what gives rise to the well-known Rwandan genocide in 1993. And what I hope I gave you very, very quickly there is an understanding of the fact that this notion of being Hutu and being Tutsi is very new, but by the 1990s it is very real. And the Hutu and Tutsi populations, who didn't used to see each other as radically separate any more than you would think that a farmer is different from you as a high school teacher, have come to see it through a lens of race, and to thus justify the killing. But it's also really important to keep in mind that so many people are killed in so many conflicts from 1958 to 1993 that the level of resentment and the level of a sense of persecution on both sides is very, very high. And that was a big rush, but I will try then to sum this up so we can move to some questions. What are the themes of genocide in the 20th century? Well, first, the justifications of genocide are usually racial or national in nature. That alternative systems of morality, such as religion, are often trumped by racial and national concerns. That it's not their moral compass entirely, one moral compass is replaced by another. The use of terror, not just murder, but also torture and rape, and the death is often drawn out by starvation, labor, and forced marches. The genocides often begin with a targeting of educated, wealthy, and leadership elements. Populations supporting genocide generally receive economic and political rewards. It's also very important to point out here that populations that resist genocide on the inside in these cases are themselves targeted, just as many, many Turks sought to protect their Armenian neighbors in the Armenian genocide. They often found themselves executed along with their Armenian neighbors. Same thing happened in Rwanda and Burundi. Hutu who defended Tutsis found themselves killed, as did Tutsis who defended Hutus on the other side of the fence. And this is a big point, many genocides are embedded in wider conflicts and wars. As such, they are morally complex, often with no clear innocent or guilty parties. And this is one of the things that makes a genocide, like the case of Rwanda, so difficult. It's not that the Tutsi were innocent victims at the hands of the Hutus, or that in Burundi, Hutus were innocent victims at the hands of the Tutsis, that there was a long legacy here of conflict between the groups. And often there are mutual atrocities, and this makes the resolution and activities to try and bring an end to these conflicts very, very difficult. Another key point here, conflict is a means to power. Genocide often serves to propel new groups to positions of leadership, be that the rise of the Khmer Rouge, or be it the establishment of a modern Turkish nation or something like that. While genocides are often understood, this is a really important point in the popular press, as resulting from ancient conflicts, they are often more a result of very modern identities. I would add here, though, that what I've not talked about here, which would take a whole nother seminar that would also run over in time, is that it's the reconstruction of histories, which is a core part of legitimizing genocide. That in order to undertake genocide, you have to rewrite the histories of whole peoples, something which certainly happens in the case of Armenia and Rwanda and Burundi, for example. Finally, international groups have shown very little willingness in general to intervene to try and stop genocides, despite the UN Convention. Genocide, it's the genocides that are intervened in that are the exceptions to the rule in the 20th century. And finally, that reconciliation is very, very difficult. And a core part of this is the desire of the victors, not a word I use lightly, but the parties who have benefited most from the genocide, their desire to deny the genocide is of course great.
Okay, Jonathan, we have come to the end, but let me be sure to get these questions in. Now, we have some really important ones here. Early in the seminar, a number of people identified some other cases that may stand as genocides. Activities in Central America, particularly in Guatemala, what's going on in Syria right now, the Australian policy toward the Aborigines, and the U.S. policy toward Native Americans. We don't really have time to go into each one of those, but I think a central question that can get us show some insight, give us some insight as to whether or not those things and others are genocide is the question of intent. Could you talk about how much does intent matter in defining a genocide?
Yeah, you know, and that's a great question. It's a core part of the legal definition of genocide as identified under the UN Genocide Resolution of 1948. That it has to be an intent to destroy in whole or in part as such. And this, of course, one of the key defenses used in the case of tactical bombing, strategic bombing during World War II, that the goal was not to kill all Germans, it was to end the war. And, you know, that I think is an example of the very real legal questions that have to be applied. If you want to adjudicate and pursue justice through judicial means as a result of genocide, you have to ask questions like this. But of course, the point is largely moot to the people who have died as a result. I would say that in some of those cases, certainly the goal was to exterminate certain populations. I think that in much of the history of North America, the goal was to exterminate Native Americans. It may not have been to do it in the next year or 2 years, but the long-term perspective certainly was to exterminate these populations, as it was very much, I think, in the case of Australia, that for a very long time in the 19th century, the British colonial government of Australia actively sought the extermination of Aboriginal populations to the point of putting bounties upon the heads of all Aboriginals. But also in cultural ways as well into the 20th century. And of course, you may recall that in the definition of genocide, it's not only to exterminate people as a genetic population, but also as a cultural population. And certainly this was the ambition of the British in Australia through much of the 20th century. Anybody who has seen the movie Rabbit Proof Fence, and while certain representations in that movie have been pointed up as not entirely accurate, the goal of schools established by the British to re-educate Aboriginal children to make them more British and less Aboriginal, as was the case, of course, in boarding schools set up for Native American populations in the United States. That goal was to undertake what we might think of as a cultural genocide, culture side, which is a term I have seen at times.
Okay, so intent really does matter. It's critical.
Yeah, in judicial proceedings, intent must be proven. So if people are going to be charged with crimes against humanity and charged with genocide, it has to be proven that they intended to eradicate a population genetically or to destroy it culturally.
Okay, another one of our participants tried to isolate a kind of a universal here that we've been talking about. You've talked a great deal about constructed identities, both the Turks and the Hutus and other groups. Our participant identified the idea of purity. So when you're constructing an identity, you really have to strive for ethnic or racial purity. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah. Smart participant, yes. And this is, I have to say that one of the things that being a world historian, not just being an African historian, but over the past decade, being a world historian has done is it has convinced me that all identities are constructed. A big part of popular histories, a big part of political histories is to convince people that their identities are natural. If you pick up your average American high school textbook, your American history textbook, the goal of that textbook is to convince you how American you are. And that's why I said that, the sort of the missing, part of the tripod here of race, nation, and blank is history, is race, nation, and history. But as a world historian, I've come to realize that there is no such thing as a natural identity. There's no natural identity of being Chinese, because what it means to be Chinese now is radically different from what it meant to be Chinese 50 years ago. Just as my notion of being an American is radically different from that of my Birmingham grandfather 50 years ago as well. But identity is always contested, and one of the great ironies of identity is that, race or nation or politics or profession, whatever it is a constructed identity, but that doesn't mean it can't get you killed if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time.
And you have to have some notion of purity. You've got to have something that, really defines you as opposed to the other. So you've got to have that other out there against which to define you.
Yeah, certainly that was part and parcel of the whole notion of scientific racism, was to identify purity of race. And, that's something we still haven't really gotten away from either. We tend to see these, however many numbers of pure races we think might exist. We have this idea that somewhere out there are people who are completely of pure blood of some kind, be that pure African or pure European or whatever. And it's a very hard mental leap to get people to realize that there is no such thing. There's really just a sort of shading of humanity, and any point in between can be just as pure and real as any point on the extremes. In fact, a real world history sort of perspective here is that it's the areas where you can't clearly see divisions that are actually the baseline in world history, not the areas on the sort of extremes where it seems more clear.
Okay. Well, one of our participants said we've just scratched the surface. Another was saying we could go on forever, and we probably could, but we can't this evening, ladies and gentlemen. Someone asked if the PowerPoint will be available. Yes, indeed. A recording of the entire seminar plus the PowerPoint will be available on the seminar website from which you obtained your readings. So I hope we've asked all of your questions. I think we've gotten the last shots in already. Please use the forum to continue the discussion, to share fresh approaches. We'll monitor the forum up until May 4th. That means that if something interesting, a good question or comment comes across our transom, we'll send it on to Jonathan and he will respond to you. Let me remind you, please submit your evaluations. They are very important to us. I want to thank all of our participants for a very intelligent and enthusiastic participation tonight. And Jonathan, I want to thank you for giving us an excellent seminar. Thank you very much.
Real pleasure. I got to say, I can't wait to sit back and read through the chat. I hope I'll be able to do that, because I have a suspicion I've missed out on some of the best material here by not being able to follow the chat.
No, I tried to bring it all in. I think we did a pretty good job getting it, and I think the way you structured the seminar, I think, really addressed all of the questions in the forum. So I don't think we left too much untended, but the more we get into this topic, obviously the deeper we can go. And as someone said, this could go on forever. But we can't let it go on forever. Everybody has things to do. So, ladies and gentlemen,
kids to put to bed.
Yes, you've got kids to put to bed, indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your participation this evening. Please go to the American Class website to see what seminars we still have yet this semester, and please check it out. We'll be putting our fall 2012 schedule up pretty soon. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, thank you and good evening. Jonathan, I thought that went well. How about you? Jonathan, you there?